Greetings, Rebel fans. My name is Jason Kelly. This is the Let's Run podcast. I want to welcome you all to the show today. It is an honor, a pleasure, a really fun kind of 24 hours for Rebel fans who, after that Boise State game and after Barry Odom left, and basically, dealing with the letdown of that was a pretty big deal. For the Rebels, for this athletic program, for the fans. It was a downer. I mean, our performance in Boise was not great. Our offense struggled. We went from possibilities of dreaming about the college football playoff to being, home alone, watching Boise State celebrate. And then, the news on Sunday morning comes out that we've lost our head coach, Barry Odom, who by all accounts is a great Rebel. Certainly, especially considering how UNLV was able to rebound in the hiring department. The departure of Barry Odom stings a little bit less, certainly than it did when we heard about the announcement. It was pretty sad to lose Barry. He was a classy guy. He was a good man who loved Rebel football, and ultimately you wish him well. But making this hire certainly gives Rebel fans a sense of hope and optimism that UNLV football isn't dead and buried, that we're not going to go back to the doldrums, the 2-10, the 3-9 seasons that we'd been experiencing for fans so long. And really, I want to go through the process of how this whole hiring process went down. I do have people that I've talked to that have that were near the situation that can shed a little bit of light on what the process was like. And so, obviously not a reporter. If you want to, Callie Finn, the Review Journal reporter that was kind of the first person to nail this story, and obviously the bigger national reporters. The first person that kind of said it was official was Joe Arrigo. So a lot of credit to him as well. He was kind of the first person to say that this is going to happen and it's been decided. So credit to him. But I can tell you a little bit about the process of hiring Dan. Dan was not, I don't want to say he wasn't among the first names mentioned. If you don't know, Dan has a relationship with, I think it's ESPN or Fox or something like that, but he was a broadcaster. And I believe he's one of the broadcasters for the Las Vegas Bowl. So Dan's been in Vegas. They've been doing a little bit of prep work. He was also a consultant for that bowl game to try and pick out which teams were going to play in that bowl game. On Sunday night, Eric Harper and the athletic department as a whole was flooded with calls, and all of Sunday, essentially. There was a lot of people. There was a ton of genuine interest in this UNLV job. People saw what Barry Odom did here, and they were impressed, and they saw the facilities, they saw Allegiant Stadium, and they said, hey, we can keep this train rolling. So there was a lot of kind of initially sifting through candidates. There was a ton of names early. Some of the names, Rolovich was a name. There was, some NFL bigger guys. There were dreams of people like Pete Carroll, there was a lot of names going on. Pat Fitzgerald, names being thrown around left and right, people contacting the Rebels left and right. They did give full consideration to Brennan Marion, who would have been kind of the, natural departure for Barry Odom and kind of giving him the job. Ultimately, if you want, this is just my opinion. This is not based on anything anybody's told me. My opinion about Brennan Marion is the Matthew Sluka situation was, I don't think the university necessarily itself did anything wrong, but Brennan's name was kind of attached to that. And so I think there was a little bit of hesitancy to go with Brennan, on top of the fact that I think Eric Harper really wanted to replicate the Barry Odom hiring formula. And hiring an assistant just wasn't a part of that. And so Brennan's name was kind of quickly, I wouldn't say it was crossed out. It was under consideration, but, Eric Harper wanted to replicate what he did with Barry. And Dan Mullen was in town for I don't know if you saw this, but Jackson Woodard was part of like the All American academic. Uh, I don't know if it was team, but he was a part of like a presentation where he could have won a national award as a player. And Dan Mullen was in attendance for that. So he was in town. One way or another, he and our athletic director and university president kind of hooked up and sat down and started to grind out, the vision for what UNLV football would look like. And Mullen expressed that he was interested in the job, but that he wanted UNLV to make certain financial commitments in order to actually achieve the goals that he would have as the head coach of the position. More than what UNLV had promised Barry Odom, for example, when Barry Odom came to UNLV. UNLV had to up its NIL funding. It had to find ways to increase the pay for play budget that UNLV has. It had to upgrade funding for staff, for auxiliary staff, and for support staff, and for the assistants. It had to give more than it was going to give under Barry Odom. It had to really commit to football if it was going to commit to football. And UNLV, by all accounts, has done that, has made those promises. Now, the payments haven't been made yet, but UNLV has committed themselves to basically doubling its NIL revenue. I don't remember who had this first. Somebody reported it, but obviously UNLV was going to have to up their price, but essentially double what they were doing before under Barry Odom, and certainly a lot more than they were doing under Marcus Arroyo. But UNLV showed to Dan Mullen a real commitment financially. Now, Dan Mullen is a guy, if you don't know him, I'm sure pretty much everybody knows who he is by now. He won 100 games in the SEC. He was the head coach. He was one of Urban Meyer's top guys at Florida during the Tim Tebow days when they won national championships. I think he was the offensive coordinator for Tim Tebow. He's very close with Tim. I hope maybe we can get Tim Tebow out to a Rebel game or something. That'd be fun. But he was basically, he was the quarterback whisperer for Tim Tebow, essentially. Now, Tim Tebow's not some awesome quarterback, but in college, he really was. And Dan has eventually turned that job into a position at Mississippi State. Now, if you know anything about the SEC, Mississippi State is not considered to be one of the upper tier jobs. But Dan Mullen really took Mississippi State to the next level. He was the head coach when Dak Prescott was there. He led them to a couple of really great seasons. I believe even at one point, Mississippi State, I'm not sure if it was during Dak's tenure at Mississippi State, but they were ranked number 1 in the country. He won a lot there and parlayed that Mississippi State job after 8 years or so into a position at the University of Florida, so the Gators. Dan Mullen was there for 4 years, I believe. His first 2 years were incredible. They went to New Year's Six Bowls. They had top 10 rankings. They won the Orange Bowl, I believe. And then in his third year, they went 8-4. Florida has insane expectations for football. The SEC is a brutal conference to try and win in. There's a reason why it's considered the best conference, and it is the best conference. But he went 8-4 in the SEC, and then he was 5-6 the next year, and basically got canned. And there was a lot of anger towards him. However, now if you talk to Florida fans now, there's a good percentage of them. And not that I've had that many conversations personally with Florida fans. It's not a fan base that you get to interact with a ton as a fan of the UNLV Rebels. But a lot of the Florida State people essentially really weren't too happy about the way that they treated Dan. This is going to be the big question from Rebel Homer. And by the way, guys, go ahead and put stuff in the chat. I can show it up here on screen. We can talk as well. If you want, go ahead and DM me if anybody wants to join in. I'm not going to go too long here, and I might do a spaces tonight so other people can talk if there's interest in that. I just didn't want to do it while people were still commuting home from work. But Dan Mullen, I think, and a lot of people think, got absolutely jobbed at Florida. Florida people were saying that he couldn't recruit, even though he was consistently pulling in top 15 recruiting classes. Florida people were saying that his teams couldn't play defense. There was, should I do a spaces? All right, for Masked Rebel, I'm going to do a spaces later as well. One where I won't be talking very much, one where you guys can talk very much, but I wanted to get a Let's Run podcast out just so that, my listeners that aren't on Twitter, if you didn't know, I primarily do Substack. Go ahead and subscribe to my Substack. It all gets sent directly to your email. So I have a lot of listeners that aren't on Twitter, and I want to make sure that they can get this kind of stuff too. So he got jobbed out of Florida. They were 5-6 in his last year. It wasn't a good year, but you have to understand that the way that college football goes is teams basically have little valleys. Every 3 or 4 years, they drop down a little bit. They have a year that's not quite as good, unless you're Georgia or Alabama. But even those schools have years where they'll struggle, and then they'll kind of rise back up. Barry Odom's last year was, you could say, started by the recruiting class that Marcus Arroyo had gotten at UNLV. And 4 years later, he kind of built that up. Now, he had added pieces around the periphery, transfers, but it was kind of the end of a talent cycle. Which is a big reason why I think Barry left. It's because a lot of seniors were graduating from this team. We're not going to have Ricky next year. In fact, there's some belief that, and this hasn't been confirmed, and I would wait for him before you jump to any conclusions about it, but there's some belief that Ricky might not play in the bowl game, which I think for a guy that's going to go to the NFL is completely understandable, and we wish Ricky the best, and we can't ask anything more of Ricky White, I don't think. But essentially, Dan Mullen got screwed out of Florida. And that experience, he was getting paid a ton of money to basically sit at home and do nothing. He got fired prematurely by an angry Florida fan base and by an angry Florida booster group. So much so that he kind of soured away from college football, especially with the proliferation of NIL and how college football has fundamentally changed at its roots. And so he said, I'm going to take a few years off, even though Mullen's not, you might think that Mullen's 60, 65 or something. No, he's 52. He's not that old. He's only a few years older than Barry Odom. So it's not like we're getting some old crustacean. No, we're getting a guy who's still in the prime of his coaching career, which is also just amazing. I just love it. But he took a few years off. He kept getting those paychecks from Florida. I believe if he took another job, he wasn't going to get the full amount that Florida was offering him. So basically, he was being paid not to coach anywhere. He was coming towards the end of this coaching contract, of this coaching payout from his job that he had at Florida because they prematurely fired him. See, Rebel Homer is showing his age here. He's only a few years older than Rebel Homer. But 52, I mean, that's not that old in terms of college football. I was a guy that would have loved a Pete Carroll or a Bill Belichick at UNLV just for the heck of it. Those guys are in their almost their mid-70s. This guy's 20 years younger than them. So Dan Mullen basically decides to jump back into the game of college football. And I want to say that, and I said this last night, I'm sure a bunch of people listening here were on the spaces that was put on by Joe Arrigo. But I said this last night that you will not find a bigger critic of the UNLV athletic department than me. There doesn't exist one. I have been as critical, as harsh on them. Eric Harper specifically, I've made jokes at his expense. I think Eric's a professional. I think he can take it. He's a public figure. He's going to take public scrutiny. But this athletic department has been absolutely railed by me consistently, specifically over how they handled the Pac-12 situation. And I won't get into too much of that, although I will say a few things about it. But today is a day to give the athletic department their flowers. A buy-in, a financial buy-in that they're doing right here is proof that while I think their Big 12 dream and the Big 12 thing that they're peddling to Rebel fans is kind of baloney. I don't think it's going to happen. In order to join the Big 12, it's not just the commissioner. It's all those schools that have to want to revenue share with you. Which is a big ask. Do you think Baylor and Texas Tech want to start sharing revenue with UNLV? That dilutes the amount of revenue that they get because it's another mouth that they have to feed. I think that UNLV is ready to double its operating expenses? I don't. But if they were trying to pull that plan off of going to the Big 12, this is like the best first step they could have taken. If you want to call hiring Barry the first step, but this is about the best thing that they could have done to get going. They've initiated a revenue sharing plan with players, supposedly. If you don't know, the Alston case that's going to be decided here in a little bit is going to permit revenue sharing with college football players on rosters. And that means that schools will be able to opt into that sharing plan. And players across college football in its entirety are going to start receiving the revenue that schools generate from TV revenue, essentially. And that's a big deal. That's a huge deal. And now, not every school that is not a Power Five school, and UNLV is not a Power Five school, has to opt into that. But UNLV is going to opt into that. You've seen something similar said by the leadership at Boise State, for example. I think San Diego State has said it too. But if you want to be serious about joining a Power Five program, you have to have a few things. You have to have sustained football success. You have to have brand. You have to have viewership and attendance. And you have to be willing to make the financial buy-in necessary to pay players. And UNLV has shown at least the start of that. Now, there's a lot more to go. It's not just making a good hire and ending up in a power conference. And some of that is out of your control. UNLV could do everything perfectly to try and end up in the Big 12 and not end up in the Big 12 anyway, because the boards of the other schools in the Big 12 don't want UNLV. So that's the part that frustrates me is, UNLV was in its own, had its own control over whether they ended up moving into the better conference. The new Pac-12 will be a better conference than the Mountain West. There's no sane person that can make the argument that it won't. And I thought that was in their control. And why not do the thing in your control? But UNLV is taking steps. It's making moves that are indicative of a school that is taking itself very seriously in terms of expansion and in terms of trying to get into one of the A4 conferences. And don't doubt it for a second. Las Vegas is a Power Four city. So is San Diego. There is no other school competing for the Las Vegas market in terms of Las Vegas residents. And so getting a guy like Dan Mullen is just a complete and utter, it's an amazing achievement. There were a lot of schools that were talking about Dan Mullen, Power Four schools that were talking about Dan Mullen that had open positions. I know that West Virginia had kind of thought about him. I know that UCF had at least considered him. At least that had been reported. Obviously, those two schools went with older coaches that had left their programs. And yeah, this is another great point that Master Rebel brings up. Like, he's got the best connections in college football. He's in the Urban Meyer tree. He's got the same friends that Urban Meyer has. He knows all the same people. He knows everybody in the television networks. If we're pitching ourselves to the Big 12, who's a good person to have on our side? Dan Mullen, who has connections with everybody in the TV industry based on his work that he's done outside head coaching. It's the perfect candidate. UNLV, I do not think, outside of like Urban Meyer, which was not going to happen because Urban Meyer is probably going to get rehired by Ohio State after Ohio State fails to win the national championship this year. Like, I cannot think of a better candidate. If anybody can think of somebody who would have been better than this, like, I don't think it exists. Like, this is like going on a date with Margot Robbie, or like I'm trying to think of like what's the highest level of achievement that you could get, like something like that. And that's also a very hypothetical example. Obviously the best person in the world to go on a date with, in my view, is my beautiful wife. But like, I don't think there's a person, and if anybody can put in the comments that a candidate that they think would have been a better choice than Dan Mullen, I'd love to hear it, because I don't think it exists. It's perfect. He's the perfect age. He's got sustained success. The dude has won New Year's Six games. He's led a team to the number one overall ranking in the country. He's unbelievably good. Well, yeah. Well, I was that was the best example that I could come up with, and you want to be careful there. Um, but it's impossible. It's impossible to find anything negative about this. I've only seen like one or two UNLV fans, and we happen to be one of the most pessimistic fan bases probably in all of sports. Uh, I think basketball is, and the last 10 years of basketball have been really rough for us, and our football history has been incredibly rough for us. But there's legitimate optimism around this program. The other thing that Dan Mullen gets you is he's going to be talked about in national media. You're going to see UNLV brought up even more than they were under Barry Odom, simply because people know Dan Mullen. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the possible negatives of hiring Dan Mullen, and there are very few. But you have to be able to think critically about it. You have to think, all right, where could this go wrong? Um, and I'm going to tell you, the first thing is when we hired Barry Odom, he was coming from another school. He was coming from Arkansas. He had been a head coach before. He had been a recruiter before, and he was able to bring players with him to UNLV. I believe Woodard was like that. Sluka comes back now. I'd take Sluka back, honestly. I think, I, I changed my mind on this 7 or 8 different times, not to get off on a tangent. Um, but I think there was a reason that Sluka was chosen as the starting quarterback over Hodge. However, you know, Hodge definitely brought a level of leadership that Sluka didn't have. So I would welcome Sluka back with open arms. But I'm very happy, obviously, with Hodge and the performance that he had this year. Nobody's perfect, but Hodge has been as good as he could have possibly been expected to be. So, and I'm grateful that Hodge has been a Rebel. But yes, I would take Sluka back in a heartbeat. Just my opinion. I know that he kind of abandoned us, but I just love talent. I'm a sucker for talent. So the negatives are that Mullen is not coming from a current staff. He's not. He wasn't a head coach who became an assistant like Barry, who brought players with him. He's coming from nothing, from cold. So what you're going to want to see with this Mullen thing is if he is hiring staff from other Power Four teams, because we're going to be wanting to bring players in, and we're not going to be able to do it with our head coach. We're going to have to do it with assistant coaches, and we want to hire people from other staffs that can help us recruit from other high-level programs to come to UNLV. That's how we got a guy like Woodard. Barry brought him with him. And we need to, because we're not going to get it from Dan Mullen, because Dan Mullen is not currently a part of any staff. He hasn't been recruiting for like 4 years now. He's going to be a little shy on current connections with current players around in the transfer portal. The next thing is, what does this mean for returning Rebels? Now, obviously, we had a lot of seniors leave the program, but not hiring Brennan Marion. Certainly there still is a possibility that there could be a mass exodus. And so it's going to be on Dan Mullen, and I believe this because he's obviously very charismatic. It's going to be on him to connect with current Rebels, to try and retain as much of this roster as possible, to sell them on a vision of a UNLV football that goes back to the Mountain West Championship game and wins it this time. It's going to be on him to do that. And I have full confidence that he can do that. The last thing is winning at UNLV is hard. It has been. Now, we're in a completely different era now. I have full faith and confidence that again, like I said, the 45 years of only 3 bowl games, I think that's completely behind us. But Barry Odom's the only person that's really ever done it. And so if lightning strikes a tree once, you say, crap, that was crazy. Now, if it starts to happen more than once, you start to see a pattern. But UNLV doesn't really have a history, and we are losing a lot of players from a very senior laden team this year. There's no doubt about that. Who could come back? I mean, you'd hope that he can keep Jet Thomas. I think Jet Thomas could be like a I don't know about All-American, but maybe. I think he could be a crazy back with a ton of yards. Marquise Cooper, if you see the San Diego State running back, the amount of production that he had, could Jet Thomas run for 1,500 yards next year? I think he could. I think he's that type of talent. I really do. Could Greg Burrell come back and run for 800 yards or 1,000 yards? I think he could. So could you keep, our running backs? Could you keep guys on our offensive line that are not seniors? That's going to be the big first step. And so I'm going to end it here in just a minute, but I'm going to try and go down to his press conference tomorrow. Maybe I'll do a lunch space after that ends. But it's going to be very interesting to hear him, with his own voice, lay out his vision of the future, lay out his vision of what UNLV is. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of fans saying, oh, we got another big name. He's just parlaying this into getting back into the SEC. And that might totally be true. But if Dan Mullen is successful and gets poached away from us, it means that we've had at least another couple of years of excellence. And right now, college football, it's in a precarious spot. Revenue sharing's coming. You could see a super league come. And every single year, it is important. We don't want to hire a guy that's going to be a project. And say what you want about Kevin Kruger as a basketball coach, he's kind of been a project. He had been he'd never had any experience before. We want to hire a guy that's going to come in and get it done from day one. So that is going to be it for tonight. I'm going to try and see if I can get down to that post game. To that press conference announcing him tomorrow. It is open to the public. I would recommend any Rebel fans that have either the afternoon off or can go down during lunch or whatever to head down to the Fertitta football complex. I imagine the crowd there is going to be pretty good. It'd be nice to give him a warm welcome and show him Rebel Nation. Meanwhile, we still have a really fun bowl game going on. It's been fun to see the Cal fans online. That's a game that's going to have a really fun feel to it, I think. I'm excited to cover that game. I'm going to see if I can get a Cal person on the podcast to talk this matchup. They just lost their starting quarterback. So, from absolute devastation a week ago, losing to Boise State to losing our head coach, times are good, man. Times are good. There's nothing to complain about as a Rebel fan. And I know that I can seem a pessimistic or an overly critical or overly negative Rebel fan. But I genuinely have faith in UNLV football and UNLV athletics, even UNLV basketball. I really have faith. And the reason why I make the arguments that I make about the Pac-12 or about whatever, or if I can seem overly negative, it's because I think this is a Power 5 program. I think this is a Power 5 city. I think it can become a Power 5 fan base and have Power 5 support. I believe in UNLV sports. I think that is what we should expect to happen. I think that ultimately UNLV has a bright future ahead of it. It's going to be fun to talk about basketball after all this is over. But Red Bone, I'm going to end it right here, but he's going to put some names in the chat. So go ahead and check those out. But I hope you guys all have a wonderful night. I'm doing this podcast from my work, from my job. I wanted to get on and go live as badly as I could. So it's official, guys. It's happening. This is not a hypothetical anymore. We made probably the best hire, maybe the best hire. Oh, here you go. I'll put these up real quick for you. So this is from Redbone Bray. Tim Brewster. Yep, that'd be a good name. Brian Johnson. I don't know who Efrain Banda is or Jonathan Banks, but those would probably be some good names for his staff. If I were him, I'd make a pitch to keep Barry Odom too. To keep Brennan Marion too. Why not? If he could up Brennan Marion's salary and keep Brennan Marion on the staff, I'd do that in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. So I think this is the best hire maybe that a Group of 5 team has ever made. And regardless if it goes badly and we end up, falling flat in their face and Dan Mullen's a complete disaster as a head coach at UNLV, this is still the right move. There's never going to be looking back in hindsight and saying, we should have gone with somebody else. That doesn't exist here. Even if he's not a great head coach at UNLV, this is still the right move to make right now because I think he will be. So I'm going to plan hopefully on maybe doing a space later tonight around 8:30 to let other Rebel fans speak. And maybe we can jump on and have a fun conversation. But I appreciate you all. I'm sure we'll all be watching his post-game press conference. Have a great night, and let's run. Woo!